Jonas Mabai, president of the Republic of Kambili, wasn't a man who sought the spotlight. Despite leading a nation, he believed that power didn't have to be loud to be effective. So when it came time for an international diplomatic trip, he chose to travel incognito security convoy. No media attention, no formal announcement. Just a well-worn passport, a navy blazer, and a simple carry-on. To anyone watching, he looked like a middle-aged African businessman traveling alone. That was exactly what he wanted. Jonas understood that sometimes the best way to see the truth was to walk through the world as if no one knew your name. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this, but it would be the first time the world would truly take notice. As he settled into his seat in the business class cabin, he glanced around, quiet and observant. This wasn't about testing anyone. It was about reminding himself of who he was when no one was looking. And in the hours that followed, that reminder would be put to the ultimate test. It started with a glance as subtle, but unmistakable. The flight attendant's eyes lingered on Jonas a little longer than necessary, her smile faltering when she looked at the seat number on his ticket. She said nothing at first, just walked past with a practiced grace. Minutes later, she returned with a hesitant tone. "Sir, I believe there's been a mistake. This seat may have been assigned incorrectly." Jonas looked up, calm and composed. "No mistake. That's my seat," he said, handing her the ticket again. She looked at it, then back at him, eyebrows raised, uncertainty now blending with something colder assumption. Behind her stood a sharply dressed European man, clearly irritated. "This was supposed to be my seat," he said, more to her than to Jonas. Jonas didn't flinch. He simply sat back, resting his hands on his lap. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. And that silence, that calm resistance, seemed to rattle them more than anything. Around them, other passengers began to take notice not of who he was, but of how he was being treated. The tension thickened. The flight attendant gave a tight smile and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Sir, would you mind relocating to economy? This gentleman is a Platinum Elite member, and we'd like to accommodate him." Jonas raised an eyebrow, not out of offense, but surprise. "You're asking me to give up the seat I paid for because of his status?" His voice was low, steady, controlled. The attendant didn't answer directly. Instead, she glanced again at the man beside her, who now looked visibly annoyed. "This is ridiculous," the man muttered. "It's obvious what's going on here." Jonas turned to face him fully for the first time. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." He didn't have to say more. The rows around them had fallen silent, and a few passengers were clearly uncomfortable. One woman, seated across the aisle, frowned and shook her head. "He was here first," she said aloud. "Leave him alone." But the damage was already done. The assumption, the entitlement, it had been on full display. Jonas wasn't trying to make a scene. But in that moment, his quiet dignity spoke louder than any argument ever could. The rest of the flight was quiet, but not comfortably so. The man grumbled under his breath for most of the trip, while the flight attendant avoided Jonas entirely. She'd speak politely to others, offering drinks with a smile, but when she passed his row, her eyes never met his again. Jonas didn't ask for anything. He simply sat, reading a dog-eared novel and sipping water, but others had noticed. A few passengers exchanged looks. One man discreetly pulled out his phone and typed something into a notes app, maybe to post later, maybe to remember. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimmed and the usual announcements played. Jonas folded his book and calmly fastened his seatbelt. When the plane landed and began taxiing toward the gate, something changed. Two airport vehicles rolled up beside the plane, their flashing lights catching attention. The doors opened, and a group of uniformed officials stepped inside, Whispers rippled through the cabin. Jonas didn't move. But the flight attendant? She paled. The CEO looked confused. Then one of the officials addressed the passengers. "We're here to welcome President Jonas Mabey of the Republic of Kambili." A stunned silence fell over the plane. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The air in the cabin felt suspended like time had paused to catch its breath. The flight attendant blinked, her mouth slightly open. The CEO, who had demanded Jonas's seat, leaned back in his chair, clearly rattled. Jonas slowly rose, nodding politely to the official who had spoken. "Thank you," he said with a calmness that now held undeniable weight. The official offered a small bow and stepped aside. Two security agents flanked Jonas, but not in a show of force, more like a quiet escort. It wasn't about power, it was about presence, and suddenly everyone on board understood why that presence had felt so unshakable from the start. The same man they dismissed as ordinary had been the most important figure on the plane. Jonas paused near the exit and turned slightly toward the flight attendant. "Respect," he said gently, "should never depend on appearances." He wasn't angry, he didn't gloat, but his words landed with unmistakable gravity. Passengers remained seated in silence as he exited the cabin, every eye following him, not because of his title, but because of his grace. News of the incident spread before the wheels of the plane had even cooled. A passenger's social media post, just a short video clip and a few words, began making the rounds online. They tried to move a president to economy. Within hours, headlines emerged across news platforms in multiple languages. People weren't just reacting to who Jonas Mabey was, they were reacting to how calmly he had handled the situation. No outburst, no threats, just quiet dignity in the face of disrespect. The airline issued a formal apology, citing a failure in protocol and promising internal review. But public reaction went deeper. Talk shows and comment sections buzzed with conversations about bias, appearance, and the danger of judging someone too quickly. In Kambili, people took to the streets not in protest, but in celebration. Portraits of Jonas were raised not as a political figure, but as a symbol of restraint, of pride, and of the power of humility. He hadn't said much, he didn't need to. The world had already heard him loud and clear. Days later, when asked about the incident during a press conference, President Mabey didn't dwell on titles or apologies. Instead, he looked straight into the camera and said, "Leadership begins when no one's watching." Respect is something we all deserve, whether seated in business class or walking down the street. That quote was shared, retweeted, and posted across the globe. In classrooms, it became a discussion topic. In corporate offices, a reflection point. And in Kambili, it was printed on posters and murals next to images of Jonas smiling humbly, violin case in hand from his early days as a teacher. The flight attendant and the CEO involved in the incident were not jailed, but both faced accountability. The CEO resigned amid public backlash, and the airline implemented new anti-bias training for staff worldwide. But the real impact wasn't punishment, it was awareness. Jonas had reminded the world of something simple yet powerful, that human worth isn't measured in status, appearance, or seat assignments. Sometimes, it's the quietest voice in the room that leaves the loudest echo. And Jonas Mabey, without raising his tone, had made the world listen.